Buonasera dall'Italia. Just a warm welcome to the participants. As you know, we are, during this period, we have organized a series of lectures given by us on a specific topics about the Italian and culture and Chinese culture. But also we have asked some of our former students to present their experience, the experience that they had in Siena. In fact, for instance, a Catholic priest introduced the issue of Siena from a mystic point of view. So Siena and its a relationship with St. Catherine. A gentleman from Switzerland talked about his experience with the palio and the beautiful video he realized about the palio days. Today is the turn of Robert Borden. You know, I started teaching at DA Siena in 1985. So I saw and I met a lot of students during more than 30 years. And a lot of them are still in my heart. Robert is definitely one of these students. He attended the program in 2018 from Brigham Young University, and the leader of the program was Dr. Jennifer Haraguchi. At the end of, I had also the pleasure to teach him a course about an anthropological lecture of Siena. And I was his mentor during the internship he attended here in Siena. At the end of the program, the nickname I gave him was Mr. President, because of his attitude in devotion, in understanding, the patience that he put in the internship, and in immerse himself into the Italian culture and into the city of Siena was something extraordinary. So for sure, he would deserve, and he will deserve, to become a president. And in fact, as soon as he came back from Siena, he was appointed president of the BYU students. So for me, it's really a pleasure and an honor to introduce everybody Robert, who can be considered the symbol of the perfect student attending an internship here in Siena. He will present, and then he will answer all your questions if you have. Thank you.
Luca, thank you so much for that extremely generous introduction. I had such a wonderful time working with you in Italy and getting to know the city of Siena. So to hear you say those things is extremely humbling, and it means a lot. So thank you. As Dr. Orton hinted at, I did write my honors thesis on a huge chunk of the experience that I had in Siena. But given that most of you, I think all of you, are not lawyers, I want to speak more from a humanist perspective today, because I think that's where we all draw our common thread. As a student, a former student, I guess, I want to talk about how my experience in Siena lifted the trajectory of my undergraduate experience, and served as a springboard to all of the other things that I did as an undergraduate student. I'll start with a story. I sat down at a round white conference table in a hot room with 3 other people. There was David, the translator, Teresa, the lawyer, and Mustafa, who was an asylum seeker. We had exchanged smiles and began a very important interview. It was the interview to prepare Mustafa, who was from Gambia, for his asylum hearing. I asked him, "How long have you been in Italy?" He said, 1 year and 6 months. And this process of question and answer went on for about 30 minutes. The team, David, Teresa, and myself, we worked to prepare Mustafa for his asylum hearing, which was so important due to the fact that he had experienced so many horrible atrocities of persecution in his native country, Gambia. He had been abused and abandoned and threatened, even threatened with death. So coming to the European Union, coming to Italy, meant that he could have a new beginning. And if the interview went well, it wouldn't just be a possibility, it would become quite certain. Just a few months before that, I had been sitting in classes at BYU, learning about politics, learning about international relations, learning about the refugee crisis in Italy and in the European Union, and all sorts of other elements of both Italy and Europe's complex economies. It was during this time that I really found a desire to learn more, not only about Italian jurisprudence, but about European jurisprudence and about the entire world. So as any good student would do, I went and found some books and started reading. First on my list was Italian Constitutional Justice in a Global Context, which was one of the most recent academic developments with regard to Italian constitutional law written from the American perspective. I also happened on the Supreme Court Justice Samuel A. Alito's senior thesis from Princeton when he was an undergraduate, where he discusses prior constitutional issues in Italy. And these questions of representation and impartiality kind of came to the forefront. My interest was piqued, and I began seeking further opportunities to learn about Italy, about international politics, and so forth. So shortly after beginning that quest, I was informed by Dr. Haraguchi, a professor of mine, we're glad that you're here, about the possibility of working for the Prefect of Siena in Italy as an intern, which, in line with the things that I had been doing, was an incredible opportunity. So while the process of allocating scarce resources as a college student to pay for the cost was difficult, when I sat down across from the Vice Prefect of Siena, Dr. Inserilli, and was able to talk to her about this opportunity to be an intern for the prefect, all of it became worth it. That day, due to an emergency, the vice prefect, Dr. Inserilli, had taken over for the prefect. So she met with our group of internship seekers and in his place. We, as a group, had traveled 6,000 miles for this opportunity and assumed that we would be greeted with open arms. But this was not exactly the case. While Dr. Inserilli was fabulously gracious, she grilled us with questions about our linguistic qualifications, our professional experience, and our personal desire to contribute. She wanted to make sure that as interns, we were going to live up to the expectations that she and the prefect had. And she went as far as to ask how well past interns from our school, from BYU, had followed Italian law. She wanted us to bring value, and I would say we got a few lucky breaks, but in the end, thanks to our fantastic professor and the other qualifications that we had as a group, we received your blessing to go ahead and continue the process of starting this internship. So once we got authorization from the prefect, we were divided for work. The majority of our group went to refugee camps, but I had the unique privilege of being invited into the administrative offices of Pangea, which is a prefect, a government interior ministry sponsored center for the hospitality of foreign asylum seekers. To put it simply, it's basically a small community dedicated to helping asylum seekers while they suffer through the legal proceedings involved with a petition for asylum. I was assigned to work with the organization's legal team, which was a hodgepodge group of lawyers and paralegals and business professionals dedicated to helping streamline the asylum process so that these asylum seekers who had come to Italy, who constitutionally have the right to counsel, receive that counsel and receive an equitable opportunity to make their petition for asylum. And the leadership at Pangea was extremely gracious, warmly welcomed me, and I gave them some details about my past experiences, my past internships, and in exchange for my experience, they gave me a few dozen pages of reading to complete before the next day in preparation for the work that I was about to do. The reading that they gave me was very interesting. It was complex. It took me and Google Translate quite a while to get through it, but we managed. The documents that they had given me included a description of basically what is the backbone of the asylum system in the European Union. So you had the Dublin Regulation 3, which is central to the European asylum seeker management, articles from the Italian Constitution. And then we got down to the nitty gritty of the prefect's policies and procedures and the Vandecum for international protection seekers in Italy. So very technical, very legal based documents. And when I finished all that reading, I had kind of a rooftop view of the asylum process, and I was excited to get to work. So I remember the next day I walked into the office and I met with Claudio, who was a paralegal, and he was an avid fan of American TV shows. But when he greeted me, he told me that one of the residents, one of the asylum seekers in the community, had damaged the car of a worker. It was Ramadan, and the man in question, this asylum seeker, had been fasting during the previous weekend when one of his friends, who was also fasting for Ramadan, passed out. And in a bit of a confused rush to get help, he begged the residence operator to take his friend to the hospital. The operator refused, noting that an ambulance was on the way, and there was a little bit of confusion there. But frustrated at his lack of ability to just take his friend to the hospital, this asylum seeker got very upset and ended up damaging the car of the residence operator. And a few days later, this asylum seeker is sitting right here in front of us in the office to deal with that issue. And it was our responsibility to go through the legal steps with them and detail the obligation that this asylum seeker had to pay for the damage that he had caused and deal with the police report that was filed against him. Now, this was difficult for me. This was a man who was indigent and alone, far away from home, who is now having to deal with the consequences of his foolish actions. And to me, in large part, it seemed he had suffered enough, so it was difficult to meet on another punishment on top of everything else that's going on in his life. But I came to realize through that experience the role of the office where I was working. It's their job in the system not to alleviate suffering. However, when that's possible, it's a nice byproduct. Their job, from my perspective, was to build community. Situations like these, where you had residents or other members of the team in conflict, were not uncommon. And not surprisingly, putting people from different countries racial and ethnic backgrounds, cultural histories and languages and so on is just a very difficult thing to do. And that's what I want to talk about in the rest of the time that I have with you. I want to share the experiences and ideas that came to be a part of who I am while I was in Siena with regard to how we can effectively build communities around the world. I've kind of divided my remarks into 4 sections that, interestingly enough, correspond with the aims of a BYU education, in large part because I believe spirit, intellect, character, and service are the ideals that we should strive for in a world that, at least to me, often seems somewhat increasingly secular-based, immoral, and self-centered. There are also 3 themes that I want to focus on. One comes from renowned economist and financier Nassim Nicholas Taleb, who talks about the concept of anti-fragility. Now, the best way that I've heard him illustrate this concept is comparing a candlestick to a roaring fire. The difference between a candlestick and a roaring fire, in essence, is that when the wind blows on a candlestick, the flame burns out. And when the wind blows on a fire, it begins to roar. So one of the themes that I want to bring out is this idea of anti-fragility, which is that idea that when the winds blow, there is a way to prepare yourself so that you can be a roaring fire and not a candlestick that burns out. The second idea comes from Jonathan Haidt, who is the writer of a number of books he talks about the concept of preparing the traveler for the road and not the road for the traveler. And then the third theme that I think will come out today is it comes from a Chinese proverb, which says that an invisible thread connects those destined to meet, despite the time, the place, or the circumstances. That thread can be tightened or tangled, but never broken. So those 3 themes again are anti-fragility, self-sufficiency, and human connection. So while in Siena, my wife and I had the opportunity to attend Catholic Mass every Sunday for about 3 months. This was a deeply edifying opportunity, and I'll never forget the beauty of the artwork and the churches, the cathedrals that we visited. They were rich with their Latin heritage, and hearing "Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name" in Latin added such a beautiful touch to our spiritual experience while we lived in Siena. Joining in community with hundreds of people just like us, but also deeply different from us, who wanted to grow closer to God through Jesus it wasn't a unique experience, but it was essential to our growing a part of the Sienese community. I think community is built largely on shared experience. Those experiences can be religious or competitive, like the palio. They can be academic, they can be constructive, industrial, or of any number of other forms. But regardless of the form, these experiences serve as the fuel for the fire of that community that roars greater when the winds arise. They are the mechanism that we use to build that sense of anti-fragility. But spiritual journeys are not traveled as a community. They're traveled individually. And I'll never forget the day that my wife, Jenny, and I sat in the back of a massive cathedral right in the heart of Siena near the confessional booth. As we sang hymns of worship with the other congregants, a gentleman entered from the rear doors and quietly walked to the confession booth. And it was clear to see that his heart was broken and his spirit was contrite. And he entered the confession booth and talked with the priest. Minutes later, he emerged from the confessional, and you could see a visible change in his eyes as he joined the congregation in singing and in praise. The words, "All creatures of our God and King, lift up your voice and with us sing," totally took on new meaning for me that day. Institutions, churches, families, neighborhoods, academies, all of these are communities, and they require us to strive to become better. They constrain us, as put by Yuval Levin in his book, A Time to Build. He says, efforts and character of institutions can grow into a way of life when the people involved in them put at the center of their cultural existence and identity, and as it were, fall into orbit around their rich moral core. So how do we prepare the road? How do we prepare the traveler for the road and not the road for the traveler? We imbue the traveler with moral expectations and strive with them to live up to this challenge. And that is difficult to do, but that builds community. Going to Mass was a fantastically beautiful experience. And furthermore, it offered us a piece of cultural Siena that allowed us to connect with those who were there in meaningful ways. For example, as I worked with the amazing team every day at Pangea, I was better able to understand their motivations as I put them into the context of their culture. For example, the director of the office where we were working was deeply dedicated to providing quality care for the asylum seekers, more so than anyone else that I had ever seen. What was it that motivated her? In large part, love for family, love for Siena, love for Italy, love for the world, love for God's creations, and the ability that I gained to see this human connection, the motivation that translated Sunday rituals into weekday, everyday practices, that made me buy in. That human connection gave me motivation to follow Annalise's example because she was so dedicated to this community. She was connected and all in and excited for the challenges because she made real connections between her work, her belief, and her desires. And this was proof for me that beliefs can translate into actions and that those actions can have the positive consequence of building a stronger community. Moving on from spiritual to intellectual, let me say that working with the people at Pangea was not easy. The expectations placed on me were significant. Intellectually, I was challenged day in and day out. Claudio, for example, one of the paralegals about whom I've already spoken, he and I were required to work together on a number of projects. One of these projects, which I was asked to spearhead, was the composition of recommendations to give to the prefect and a delegation of ambassadors who would be attending an upcoming conference where we would discuss best practices for migrant processing. So to develop these recommendations, I was required to research the practices of each member state in the European Union, identify the inefficiencies in the process, and then generate a database of information to present at the conference. What I found was quite noteworthy, and it was that some member state, in some of the member states in the European Union, there's an emphasis placed on self-sufficiency. This is done often by requiring migrants to, in some sense, go it alone with regard to, for example, housing, food, clothing. The government grants these asylum seekers an amount of money each month as a stipend, and then the asylum seeker is required to provide the rest. Other member states, however, took a more invasive approach, a more hands-on approach. They operated to feed and to house and to clothe and to assist the migrants every step of the way. And the outcomes of these two approaches, I think, really could not illustrate more clearly the importance of preparing the traveler for the road versus the road for the traveler. In my research, I found that in countries where self-sufficiency is emphasized, the migrants seeking asylum more readily inject themselves into the community. They build the community, okay, as they are required to be self-sufficient. They're forced to learn new things, and that's difficult. They learn language in practice, not in the classroom. They get jobs real fast, and they have to find their housing and their clothing by their own effort. This is deeply gratifying and self-sustaining. It allows the migrants to become active participants in the building of community. On the other hand, there were countries that didn't quite emphasize self-sufficiency in the same way. And that's not to say that they didn't. But often these countries found themselves in a rut between new arrivals, the many migrants who were continuing to come from these war-torn and difficult countries, and those who are trying to leave the cradle of government support. While the living conditions and the necessities are all taken care of quite well for those who are in the system, the government generally cannot sustain the long-term support of an individual migrant. That migrant ideally is going to get to the point where they can move up and move on to being a citizen and to being a part of that community, which is a difficult but a possible outcome. So building strong communities requires governments, nonprofits, the private sector, and all other stakeholders to hold community members to a high level of self-sufficiency. I think not only in this way, but in this way in part, they can avoid burning the candle at both ends and ensure that the community becomes that anti-fragile, roaring, fueled fire. The difficulty is that as people are invited to be self-sufficient, interactions with other people are not always easy. And I saw this almost every day. It takes character, a sort of moral and mental anti-fragility that then allows for the expression of ideas that can lead to added community strength and eventually innovation and the pursuit of excellence in unity. Otherwise, those ideals become fragmented. We see this, for example, right now in the United States. Deeply rooted race relations issues and long delayed conversations about cross-cultural communication and interaction have led to riotous outbursts and, unfortunately, well too much hatred. While traveling through Italy on a train early on in my stay in Siena, the ticket collector came to my seat. He asked me for my ticket, and I handed it to him. He looked at me then, and then he looked at the ticket again, and he told me, "Sir, you've purchased the wrong route, and you need to pay a fine and buy another ticket." And at that point, I kind of lost it. It was an accident, and I didn't purchase the right ticket. And in my mind, riding on the Utah train, an officer on the train wouldn't ask me to buy another ticket after buying the wrong one. He'd tell me I was wrong, and then he would expect me to do it right the next time. Boy, was I wrong with that. The Italian officer was kindly telling me how to act within their community, and I needed to learn and interact with that community in a different way. Interacting with officers of the law in other nations and cultures is difficult, and interacting with any authority in another nation or culture is difficult, because that cross-cultural communication and the personal expectations vary so vastly from place to place. In Italy, on the train, and in many places after that, I was required to do a few things in order to bridge that gap of communication. One, I needed to listen. Two, I needed to try and piece together what was being said and understand. And three, I often needed to change my behavior in order to meet the expectations of the community where I was living. The institution of that community was trying to forge me, in large part, I believe, to be a better person. Generally, I found that when I listened and I sought to understand, I was able to get through the difficulties of any particular experience. However, when on the train, like on the train, I let my confusion turn into anger or frustration, I was never really able to make it through. I think building community requires that we approach situations of stress like that on the train or any other with this attitude of careful listening. Building community requires that we try to understand the distress and the concern of others, putting them before ourselves. And building community requires that we let go of the grudges or the anger or the contempt that we have through these periods of reconciliation. I think whether you find yourself in Italy or in the United States, in Hong Kong or Beijing, there is great power in listening, putting others first, and letting go of contempt or enmity, anger or hatred. When this happens, people come together, the fire of community burns brighter and stronger, and our ability to travel the road before us grows stronger as well. And those connections that we forge with other humans, our fellow travelers in the journey, become more numerous and they become more meaningful. Now, I think meaningful connection can be derived in a number of different ways, but there's perhaps no better way to develop meaningful connection to a particular community than through service. And living in Siena made it plainly apparent to me that the service, that service is at the center of any strong community. You walk through the neighborhoods, the beautiful streets of Siena, and it is impossible to not notice the flags of the various neighborhoods hanging from the balconies, windows, rear view mirrors, and cars. But these flags are deeply significant. They represent smaller communities. They represent teams of people united in efforts to solve the problems of their day with hope for a better and for a brighter future. As all of us know, Siena's history is rich with tradition. The history of the Palio has long been sung. But that competition, that shared experience, as I mentioned earlier, breeds unity. And it is that unity that provides a platform for service. I can remember opportunities to sit down and eat dinner in one of these neighborhood groups, or to go into the kitchen and prepare a meal with members of these communities. And it was this consistently getting together and consistently serving one another that bridged the different cultures and histories and races and origins and ideologies. Now, let me take this a step further. Service is often a little bit convoluted and I think emphasized as difficult, but I want to argue that it is quite simple. At least by my experience in Siena and experiences that I've had after, I found that serving the person closest to you is the best way to increase the impact of your service. It's almost like concentric circles. As I reach my neighbor, they reach their neighbor, and they reach their neighbor, and the next thing you know, the service that I have done has reached the other side of the world as neighbor serves neighbor. Our host in Siena while we lived there, Vanna, who graciously allowed us to live in her home, eat meals with her, who washed our clothes and listened to the many stories that we had to tell. She was, and to this day is, the very epitome, the meaning of kindness and the definition of service in my mind. And it's those memories that serve in large part as my motivation to serve. So in sum, the things that I learned in Siena can quite simply be restated as: one, community is based largely in shared experience, be it spiritual or otherwise. Two, the research that I conducted shows that it is often better to prepare the traveler for the road than vice versa. Three, the road to character is the road less traveled, but it is the road worth traveling. And finally, that service is at the center of strong communities. In conclusion, I'll just say that these lessons weren't learned without effort and diligence on my part and the part of all of those who taught me. It took a lot of time and patience and trial and error to get to the heart of what I needed to understand from my experience in Italy. But I will say that understanding the message and the meaning of these ideas and these experiences served as the foundation for my entire undergraduate experience. I went to Italy the summer, my second summer, and the second summer of my undergraduate experience, and everything after that was completely enhanced by the things that I had learned. Had I not done the work that I did in Italy, I would not have had the opportunity to represent the United States in China a year later as part of a delegation of students studying international relations and diplomacy. Had I not developed my own sense of, if you will, this concept of anti-fragility, the fire versus the little flame of the candle, the roaring fire versus the candle, had I not developed that in myself through my experience in Siena, and thanks to the dear friends that I developed in Siena, I don't know that I would have been prepared for the road ahead that I faced as a future candidate for the BYU Student Service Association presidency. And I don't know that I ever would have even challenged myself to take advantage of that opportunity to run. And certainly, were it not for my understanding of the power of shared spiritual experience, I don't think I would have been, and I wouldn't have gone to the national prayer breakfast that I went to here in the United States in January, which was another experience that I had, and I wouldn't have the opportunities from that are going to come. I'll soon be in Washington, D.C., and participating in these cross-cultural religious conversations. And were it not for the foundation that I had developed in Siena, that would never have been an opportunity for me. So in sum, my experience in Siena is largely at the heart of who I am. It was the foundation of my undergraduate experience, the research that I did for my honors thesis, and my hope is that my remarks have given you some idea of both what it means to be a part of a community like that of Siena or any other in the world. And hopefully you've been able to think of ways that you might strengthen the many communities that you undoubtedly take membership in. So let's go out and build communities in a positive way. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
I have a comment. So all of the people who are listening to you, Robert, Mr. President, can realize why you have a special place in my heart. I also have to say that you were one of the first to write me middle of February, to email me asking after 2 years more or less, asking about the situation, how was the coronavirus situation. And I got a lot of emails from former students, and your was one of the first. This is a lot to me. You are really the example of the perfect combination, because between taking advantage of a study abroad experience but giving in the meantime so much to the hosting community in terms of energy, time, patience, loves, and this means a lot for Siena, first of all, and then for the ASEAN and for me in particular. So if you have any question. You can also comment, not just ask something.
Personally, I wanted just to thank Robert for the wonderful words that he have spent, especially for the city of Siena. I think it was extremely an insight extremely interesting on our end, because it also let us see from another perspective what in terms of education this environment can give.
Thank you, Guido. I hope that the remarks that I made hint at the value that Siena brings to the world as a template for a strong community. So thank you for that. Virginia, to answer your question, you said, am I working now or still in school? I just graduated from BYU, and I will be working for the next year, and then I'll be going to law school after that.
And when
Sorry, can you repeat that, Luca?
When president of the US?
A long ways away, if ever there.
Please remember of your friends.
Thank you. I absolutely will. Virginia, to answer what type of job will I seek? So for the next year, I'll be working with a religious group in Washington, D.C., working on questions of religious freedom here in the United States. And after that, Joe, to answer your question, I will go to law school, and after that, I'll be a lawyer. I'm still exploring what that looks like with regard to a specific career plan, but I am hopeful that I can join the force of the world's servant lawyers, I guess. So it is a rather technical degree, but hopefully it can be used to serve people as well.